Standing in Terminal B at Chicago O'Hare, I watched my family disappear through the first-class boarding gate while clutching a crumpled Greyhound bus ticket in my sweaty palm. My father Richard adjusted his platinum Rolex as he guided my 17-year-old sister Emma toward their Dubai flight. My mother Patricia kissed Emma's forehead tenderly, but barely glanced at me. Dad claimed budget constraints forced this arrangement, yet his diamond cufflinks sparkled under the fluorescent lights. Emma giggled about shopping in gold souks while I faced a 14-hour bus ride home to our empty mansion. 20 years old and supposedly family, I felt more like hired help being dismissed after completing my duties. The silence in our suburban mansion felt heavier than usual when I returned from the airport. Our 8-bedroom house in Winnetka sat on 3 acres of manicured lawn, but without my family's voices echoing through the marble hallways, it resembled a mausoleum more than a home. I trudged upstairs to my room, still processing the humiliation of watching them board that plane without me. My father owned Hartwell Construction, one of Illinois' most successful building companies. We had money. Serious money. The kind that bought luxury cars, private school tuition, and month-long vacations to Dubai. So why was I holding a bus ticket instead of sitting in first class? I decided to clean my room to distract myself from the gnawing feeling of abandonment. While moving my desk to vacuum underneath, I accidentally bumped into the wall with more force than intended. A section of baseboard trim shifted, revealing a small gap behind it. Curious, I pried at the loose board until it came free, exposing a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside sat a metal lockbox, dusty and forgotten. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. The lock had rusted enough that a firm twist broke it open. What I found inside made my stomach drop to my shoes. Bank statements, dozens of them dating back 5 years. But these weren't regular accounts. These showed wire transfers to numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands totaling millions of dollars. Invoices for city construction projects with costs inflated by 300%. Receipts for building materials that were never delivered to job sites. Correspondence with city officials discussing consultation fees that looked suspiciously like bribes. My father wasn't just wealthy, he was a criminal. I spread the documents across my bedroom floor, trying to make sense of the scope of what I was seeing. Hartwell Construction had been awarded contracts to build schools, hospitals, and public housing developments throughout Cook County. According to these papers, Dad had been using substandard materials, pocketing the difference, and bribing inspectors to approve the shoddy work. One folder contained medical reports: children injured when a ceiling collapsed at Riverside Elementary School, hospital patients hurt when faulty electrical work caused a fire in the pediatric ward, families displaced when an apartment complex foundation cracked, making the building uninhabitable. People had been hurt because of my father's greed. But the worst discovery came at the bottom of the box. A manila envelope marked College Fund, CH. My college fund. The money my grandparents had left me for education had been emptied and funneled into those offshore accounts. Every penny meant for my future had been stolen to finance these illegal operations. I found correspondence between my father and his lawyer discussing contingency plans if the fraud was discovered. They had prepared documents to frame me for the financial crimes, claiming I had stolen the money and doctored the books. My own father planned to throw me under the bus to save himself. Emma's name appeared nowhere in these backup plans. She was being groomed as the clean heir, the innocent daughter who would inherit the legitimate portions of the business, while I took the fall for everything illegal. As I continued digging through the papers, my hands stopped shaking and started clenching into fists. There, at the very bottom, lay a folder I almost missed. The tab read, Adoption, Final Decree. I opened it with numb fingers. The documents inside revealed that I wasn't Richard and Patricia's biological son. I had been adopted at age 3 after my biological parents, Michael and Sarah Coleman, died in a car accident. But as I read further, the accident details made my blood run cold. The crash had occurred when their car went through a guardrail on Highway 94. The guardrail had been installed by Hartwell Construction just 2 months earlier. According to the police report, the barrier had been improperly anchored and gave way on impact, sending their car into the ravine below. My father had killed my real parents with his shoddy construction work, then adopted me to claim the insurance money and government benefits available to families who took in orphaned children. He had never intended to treat me as a real son. I was just another revenue stream in his criminal enterprise. The Dubai trip suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't a vacation. It was a business meeting to launder money through overseas investments, and they couldn't risk me discovering the truth while they were gone. Except their plan had backfired spectacularly. I had found everything. The next morning, I sat in the law offices of Brennan and Associates, clutching a folder full of photocopied evidence. I had spent the entire night documenting everything, taking pictures of every document before carefully returning them to the hiding place. My hand still shook, but now from determination rather than shock. Harold Brennan. The lawyer listed as my biological parents' representative in the adoption papers was a distinguished man in his 70s with kind eyes and silver hair. He listened intently as I explained my discovery, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never showing surprise at the scope of corruption I described. "Your biological parents were good people, Cletus," he said finally, using my real name for the first time in years. Michael and Sarah Coleman were structural engineers who had been investigating construction irregularities in several public projects. They suspected fraud but died before they could present their findings to authorities. He pulled out a thick file from his cabinet. "They left you a substantial inheritance. A life insurance policy worth $1.2 million plus a trust fund with accumulated interest that should be worth about $800,000 by now. Richard Hartwell has been illegally accessing those funds through forged documents claiming guardianship expenses." The room spun around me. Not only had my father killed my real parents and stolen my education fund, he had been robbing my inheritance for 17 years. "Oh, we can reclaim everything," Harold continued, "and expose the fraud. But we need ironclad evidence that will hold up in federal court. What you found is a good start, but we need more." I spent the next week living a double life. During the day, I worked at a photography studio downtown, earning money to pay Harold's retainer and hire a private investigator. The owner, Mrs. Angela Torres, was a kind woman who let me pick up extra shifts and learn about document photography and evidence preservation. At night, I carefully photographed every document in that metal box, creating multiple copies stored in different locations. I also began exploring the house more thoroughly, finding additional hiding places where my father kept records. The private investigator, a former FBI agent named Jake Morrison, worked quickly to expand our evidence base. Within days, he had identified other victims of Hartwell Construction's fraud and connected our case to a broader pattern of corruption involving city officials. "Your father has been paying off Mayor Davidson, 3 city council members, and the chief building inspector for at least 6 years," Jake reported during one of our clandestine meetings at a diner on the south side. But here's the interesting part. His business partner, Marcus Webb, has been keeping his own insurance policy. He's got recordings of conversations, duplicate records, everything. Webb knows your father will eventually throw him under the bus, so he's preparing to strike first. Jake's most disturbing discovery came when he investigated the elementary school ceiling collapse that had injured 12 children the previous year. The support beams were supposed to be steel. Your father substituted aluminum painted to look like steel. He saved about $50,000 per beam and pocketed the difference. Those kids are lucky the whole roof didn't come down. But then Jake delivered news that made my blood freeze. "Cletus, I've been monitoring your father's communications. They're planning to cut their Dubai trip short. They'll be back in 5 days instead of the planned month." "Why?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Your father received word that someone has been asking questions about Hartwell Construction. He doesn't know it's us, but he's spooked. And Cletus," Jake paused, looking uncomfortable, "I intercepted some encrypted messages between your father and a contact in Chicago. He's arranged for what he calls cleaning house. That's criminal code for eliminating loose ends." The photographs Jake showed me next were of a man named Vincent Torres, a known enforcer with connections to organized crime. Bank records showed a $50,000 payment from one of Richard's shell companies to Torres with a note reading, "Property Maintenance, CH Residence." My father had hired someone to kill me. The Dubai trip wasn't just about laundering money. It was about establishing an alibi while I was murdered in what would look like a burglary gone wrong. When they returned, they would find me dead, my room ransacked and any evidence of the fraud conveniently destroyed in the break-in. "We have to accelerate everything," Harold said when I brought him this news. 5 days to build a case that normally takes months. "There's something else," Jake added grimly. "I did some deeper digging into your father's past. Remember that business partner who supposedly died in a boating accident 3 years ago? Stephen Caldwell. I found evidence suggesting that wasn't an accident either." The scope of my father's crimes kept expanding. He wasn't just a fraud artist. He was a serial killer who eliminated anyone who threatened his operation. As we worked around the clock to prepare our case, I made a decision that surprised even myself. Despite everything he had done to me, I couldn't let him destroy Emma, too. She was innocent in all this, just a 17-year-old girl who loved the man she thought was her father. She deserved to know the truth before it was too late. But first we had to make sure I survived the next 5 days. Harold's office became our war room. Legal documents covered every surface as we worked 18-hour days to prepare an airtight case. Jake had installed surveillance equipment in my house to monitor for Vincent Torres or any other threats while I continued my normal routine to avoid raising suspicion. The private investigators' deeper digging had uncovered a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of county government. But more importantly, he had made contact with Marcus Webb, my father's business partner, who was preparing to betray him. I met Marcus at a parking garage downtown on a rainy Tuesday night. He was a nervous man in his 50s, constantly checking over his shoulder and chain-smoking cigarettes. But he brought with him a briefcase full of evidence that made our case bulletproof. "Your father's completely lost his mind," Marcus told me, his voice shaking. "He used to be satisfied with skimming profits and cutting corners. But over the past 2 years, he's become paranoid and violent. I think the guilt from killing those people in the school collapse pushed him over the edge." Marcus revealed details that made me sick to my stomach. Richard had been systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to his operation. The journalist who had been investigating construction corruption had died in what looked like a mugging. The building inspector who had refused to approve a particularly dangerous project had supposedly committed suicide. "He's got a whole system worked out," Marcus continued. "Vincent Torres handles the direct killings, but your father has other methods too. He's been poisoning his own wife." My heart stopped. "What?" "Patricia's been getting sick a lot lately." "Right. Headaches, fatigue, memory problems. He's been putting mercury in her vitamins, small doses over time. He plans to make it look like natural causes after he deals with you and figures out what to do about Emma." The realization hit me like a physical blow. My mother's increasing distance and strange behavior over the past year wasn't just emotional withdrawal from an abusive marriage. She was being slowly murdered. Marcus handed me recordings he had made of his conversations with Richard, including one where my father detailed his plans for my death and discussed accelerating Patricia's poisoning. "I'm giving you everything," he said. "In exchange, I want full immunity and witness protection. This man is a monster, and I should have stopped him years ago." Back at Harold's office, we now had enough evidence to bring down not just Richard, but the entire corruption network. The federal prosecutor Harold had contacted was preparing arrest warrants for 12 people, including the mayor and half the city council. But we still faced the immediate problem of keeping me alive for 3 more days until Richard returned from Dubai. Jake had discovered that Vincent Torres was already in Chicago, staying at a motel near the airport and conducting surveillance of our house. "He's waiting for the signal from your father," Jake explained, "probably planning to strike the night before they return, giving him time to clean up and disappear before the family gets back." We decided to turn the tables. Instead of waiting to be victimized, we would trap Torres in the act and use his arrest to force him to testify against Richard. Jake coordinated with federal agents who were now involved in the case, setting up a sting operation at my house. While preparing for this confrontation, I made another horrifying discovery. Going through more of my father's hidden documents, I found Emma's birth certificate. The father listed wasn't Richard Hartwell. Emma wasn't his biological daughter either. DNA test results hidden in the same folder confirmed that Emma was the result of an affair Patricia had with another man 18 years ago. Richard had been using this secret to blackmail and control my mother for nearly 2 decades, threatening to expose her adultery and take Emma away if she ever tried to leave him or report his crimes. This explained Patricia's strange behavior toward both Emma and me. She wasn't cold because she didn't love us. She was desperately trying to protect us by maintaining emotional distance, hoping Richard would see us as less threatening if we weren't close to her. Reading through intercepted emails on Richard's laptop, I learned he planned to frame both Emma and me for his crimes upon returning from Dubai. We would both die in the burglary, eliminating any potential witnesses while making him appear to be the grieving father and husband whose entire family had been murdered by criminals. Patricia would die more slowly from mercury poisoning, giving him time to comfort and remarry before anyone suspected anything. The scope of his evil was breathtaking. He had spent years positioning himself to murder his entire family and emerge as the sympathetic victim while covering up decades of fraud and multiple murders. As I sat in Harold's office reviewing the final details of our case, I realized something that both terrified and empowered me. My father had made one crucial mistake in his planning. By excluding me from the Dubai trip and leaving me alone with access to the house, he had given me exactly what I needed to destroy him. Tomorrow night, Vincent Torres would come to kill me, but instead of finding a helpless victim, he would walk into a trap that would bring down the entire criminal organization. The scared 20-year-old who had been handed a bus ticket at the airport was gone. In his place stood someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to fight back with everything you have. The house felt different when I heard the Mercedes pull into our circular driveway 3 days earlier than expected. I had been watching from my bedroom window, having received word from Jake that their flight had landed 2 hours ago. The federal sting operation to capture Vincent Torres had been successful. He was now in custody and had immediately started talking in exchange for a reduced sentence. I walked downstairs slowly, trying to appear normal while my heart hammered against my ribs. Everything I had discovered, everything I had planned came down to the next few hours. Richard entered first, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel, but his eyes sharp and alert. He scanned the foyer like a predator checking for threats, his gaze lingering on details that might reveal whether anyone had been in the house while they were gone. "Hello, son," he said, the word dripping with false warmth. "How did you manage while we were away?" "Fine," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Kept myself busy." Emma bounced through the door, next her arms full of shopping bags and her face glowing with excitement. "Cletus, you should have seen Dubai. The Burj Khalifa was incredible, and the shopping malls were like palaces. Dad bought me this amazing necklace with real diamonds." She hugged me enthusiastically, and for a moment I felt sick, knowing that she had no idea about the man she still called father or the danger she was in. Her innocence and genuine affection made what I had to do even more difficult. Patricia came in last, moving slowly and looking pale. The mercury poisoning was clearly taking its toll. Her hands shook slightly as she set down her purse, and she avoided eye contact with everyone. But when she glanced at me briefly, I caught something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Fear, but also a kind of desperate alertness. "I need to unpack," she said quietly. "The flight was very long." "Of course, darling," Richard replied smoothly. "Emma, why don't you show Cletus your souvenirs? I need to check on some business matters in my study." My blood turned to ice. He was going to check the hiding place where I had found the evidence. Even though I had been careful to return everything exactly as I found it, there was always a chance he would notice something amiss. Emma chattered excitedly about their trip while I tried to listen and respond appropriately. She described the luxury hotel, the desert safari, the expensive restaurants, but underneath her enthusiasm, I detected something else. A nervousness she hadn't shown before, as if the trip hadn't been entirely the paradise she was describing. "Emma," I said carefully, "did you have fun the whole time? You seem a little tired." Her smile faltered slightly. "Oh, it was wonderful. It's just, Dad was on his phone a lot having these intense conversations, and Mom was sick most of the time. I spent a lot of time by myself, actually." Before I could respond, we heard Richard's voice booming from his study. "Cletus, come here, please." Emma's eyes widened at the anger in his tone. I walked toward the study on unsteady legs, knowing this moment would determine everything. Richard stood behind his desk, his face a mask of controlled fury. On the desktop lay the metal lockbox, now empty, and several of the documents I had photographed. "Would you like to explain how these ended up scattered around my study?" He asked quietly, his voice more dangerous than if he had been shouting. I forced myself to look confused. "I don't understand what you mean, Dad. What are those papers?" "Don't play stupid with me, boy." He stepped around the desk, moving closer. "Someone has been through my private files. Someone photographed these documents. And since we've been out of the country, that leaves exactly one person who had access to this house. I never went in your study." I lied, backing toward the door. "Maybe someone broke in while you were gone. Did you check if anything was stolen?" Richard's laugh was cold and humorless. "Nothing was stolen, but copies were made. I can tell because the papers aren't in the exact order I left them, and there are fingerprint smudges on documents that should have been pristine." He pulled out his cell phone. "I'm calling Vincent. This situation needs to be handled immediately, not tomorrow night as planned." My heart stopped. He was accelerating the timeline for my murder. But then Patricia appeared in the doorway, her face deadly pale, but her voice surprisingly strong. "Richard, what's going on? Why are you shouting?" "Your adopted son has been snooping through my business files," Richard snarled. "He's seen things that could cause serious problems for our family." Patricia's eyes met mine across the room, and I saw understanding flash in them. She knew. Somehow she knew what I had discovered. "What kind of things?" she asked carefully. "The kind that require permanent solutions." Richard replied, his fingers already dialing Vincent's number. That's when Emma's voice cut through the tension from the hallway. "Dad, I think you should know something about your phone calls in Dubai." We all turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her face no longer that of an innocent teenager, but showing a maturity and determination I had never seen before. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, lowering his phone. Emma pulled out her own phone, a small device I hadn't noticed before. "I recorded your conversations. All of them. Including the one where you talked about killing Cletus and making it look like a robbery." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, rage, calculation, and finally a cold emptiness that was more terrifying than anger. "You recorded me," he said slowly. "I've been recording you for months," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "Ever since I overheard you talking about Mom's medical problems and how convenient it would be if she died naturally. I knew something was wrong, so I started documenting everything." Richard's mask finally slipped completely. The pretense of being a loving father and husband vanished, revealing something inhuman underneath. "You stupid little bitch," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Patricia gasped at the venom in his voice, but Emma stood her ground. "I know exactly what I've done," she said firmly. "I've been protecting our family from a monster." Richard lunged toward Emma, but I stepped between them. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the man who had controlled our family through fear and manipulation. "It's over. Richard," I said, using his first name intentionally. "We know everything. The fraud, the murders, the poisoning. Vincent Torres is already in federal custody and he's telling them everything about your operation. The change in his demeanor was instant and terrifying. The last pretense of humanity disappeared from his eyes, and I found myself looking at someone capable of absolutely anything. If that's true, he said quietly, then none of you can be allowed to live. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Richard opened his desk drawer and pulled out a gun I had never known existed. Patricia screamed and grabbed Emma, pulling her behind the heavy leather chair while I dove behind the bookshelf. 20 years, Richard said conversationally, as if he wasn't holding a weapon on his own family. 20 years I've been building this empire, and you ungrateful parasites want to tear it down. He kept the gun trained on our hiding spots while reaching for his phone with his free hand. Vincent might be in custody, but I have other resources. People who can clean up this mess and dispose of all the evidence. Richard, please, Patricia pleaded from behind the chair. These are your children. These aren't my children, he screamed suddenly, his composure finally cracking. That boy is the son of 2 people I had to eliminate because they were threatening my business. And that girl is the bastard offspring of your affair with your tennis instructor. Emma gasped behind the chair. This was the first time she was hearing the truth about her parentage. You've all been liabilities from the beginning. Richard continued, his voice returning to that terrifying calm. Cletus with his questions and his need for attention. Emma with her recording devices and her naive sense of right and wrong. And you, Patricia, with your guilty conscience and your pathetic attempts to protect them. He moved closer to where Patricia and Emma were hiding. I should have killed you all years ago and saved myself the trouble. The FBI already has everything, I called out from behind the bookshelf. Harold Brennan turned over all the evidence this morning. Even if you kill us, you can't stop what's coming. Richard paused, processing this information. Harold Brennan. Your biological parents' lawyer. I should have eliminated him along with them, but he seemed harmless enough. The casual way he discussed murdering people made my skin crawl. This wasn't a man who had gradually become corrupt. This was someone fundamentally evil who had been hiding behind a mask of respectability for decades. You want to know something interesting about your parents' car accident? Richard asked, moving closer to my hiding spot. They didn't die on impact. I found them conscious in their car at the bottom of that ravine and watched them drown when the creek water rose. They kept calling your name as the water filled their lungs. Rage exploded through me like nothing I had ever experienced. I launched myself from behind the bookshelf, tackling Richard around the waist and driving him backward into his desk. The gun went flying across the room, skittering under a filing cabinet. We crashed into the desk, sending papers and office supplies everywhere. Richard was stronger than me, but I had the advantage of youth and fury. We grappled across the floor, each trying to reach the fallen weapon. Cletus the window, Emma shouted. I glanced up to see federal agents surrounding the house, their weapons drawn. Jake Morrison and Harold Brennan stood behind them, directing the operation. Our legal preparation had included coordination with law enforcement, and they had been waiting for the signal to move in. But Richard had noticed them too. With a strength born of desperation, he threw me off and scrambled toward the filing cabinet where the gun had landed. If I'm going down, you're all coming with me, he snarled, his fingers closing around the weapon. That's when Patricia did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and brought it down hard on the back of Richard's head just as he was raising the gun. Richard collapsed forward, momentarily stunned but still conscious and still holding the weapon. Blood trickled from his scalp as he tried to orient himself. You poisoned me, Patricia said quietly, her voice carrying 20 years of suppressed rage. You stole from these children. You murdered innocent people. And you made me complicit through my silence and fear. She raised the paperweight again. No more. But before she could strike, the study door exploded inward as federal agents stormed the room. FBI dropped the weapon. Richard looked around wildly, taking in the agents, the blood on his hands, and his family staring at him with a mixture of fear and disgust. For a moment, I thought he might surrender. Instead, he grabbed Emma, pulling her against his chest with the gun pressed to her temple. "Stay back," he screamed at the agents. "I want safe passage to the airport and a plane fueled and ready. If anyone tries to stop me, the girl dies." Emma's eyes were wide with terror, but she managed to look at me and mouth the words, "I'm sorry," as if any of this was her fault. "Let her go, Richard," I said, stepping forward despite the guns pointed in our direction. "She's just a kid. She doesn't deserve this." "None of you deserved this," he replied, his voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "But life isn't about what people deserve. It's about who has the power to take what they want." That's when he made his final confession, speaking directly to the federal agents as if he wanted them to understand the scope of his accomplishments. "I've been poisoning Patricia for 8 months with mercury compounds mixed into her vitamins. Small doses, untraceable unless you know what to look for. She would have died naturally in another 6 months, and no one would have suspected anything." Patricia staggered backward, the full reality of how close she had come to death hitting her like a physical blow. And those building collapses that hurt all those children, I knew exactly what would happen when I substituted inferior materials. I just didn't care because each shortcut added $50,000 to my profit margin. The federal agents exchanged glances, clearly disturbed by his casual attitude toward mass casualties. Richard Hartwell, the lead agent, said formally, "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and multiple counts of homicide. You have the right to remain silent." "I'm not going to prison," Richard said simply. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Richard suddenly spun Emma away from him with one arm while raising the gun to his own temple with the other. But Emma, showing incredible presence of mind, used the momentum of his spin to break completely free and dive toward the floor. The agents didn't hesitate. The moment Emma was clear, they opened fire. Richard Hartwell died, instantly collapsing to the floor of his study, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes and the family he had terrorized for 2 decades. In the sudden silence that followed the gunshots, Emma crawled over to where Patricia and I were huddled together. For the first time since I could remember, we held each other as a real family, united. Not by the legal fiction of adoption or the lies that had bound us together, but by the shared experience of survival. "It's over," Patricia whispered, her voice breaking. "It's finally over." But even as federal agents secured the scene and paramedics checked us for injuries, I knew this was really just the beginning. We had survived Richard's evil, but now we had to figure out how to rebuild our lives from the wreckage he had left behind. 6 months after that terrible night in Richard's study, I sat in a federal courtroom watching the man who had destroyed so many lives face the consequences of his actions. Except, Richard was no longer alive to face justice. Instead, I was testifying against the network of corrupt officials who had enabled his crimes for years. The trial had become a media sensation, exposing a web of corruption that reached into every level of Cook County government. Mayor Davidson sat at the defendant's table alongside 3 city council members, the chief building inspector, and 2 other contractors who had participated in the fraud scheme. "Mr. Coleman," the federal prosecutor said, using the surname I had legally reclaimed from my biological parents, "please tell the court about the documents you discovered in the defendant's home." I looked out at the packed courtroom, seeing the faces of Richard's victims and their families. 12 children who had been injured in the elementary school collapse. Families displaced when their apartment building became uninhabitable. The widow of the journalist Richard had murdered for investigating construction corruption. I found evidence of systematic fraud dating back at least 7 years, I testified. Inflated invoices, bribery payments, and documentation of substandard materials being used in public construction projects. The prosecutor displayed photographs of the hidden documents on a large screen for the jury. "Did you find evidence that the defendants were aware these materials would create safety hazards?" "Yes. There were emails discussing the risks of using aluminum beams painted to look like steel. Mayor Davidson specifically approved the substitution, despite warnings from his own engineering staff that it could lead to structural failures. Mayor Davidson's lawyer objected, but the evidence was overwhelming. We had recordings of conversations where city officials discussed covering up safety violations in exchange for campaign contributions from Hartwell Construction. The most damaging testimony came from Marcus Webb Richards' former business partner, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation. Marcus detailed how the corruption scheme worked, naming every official who had taken bribes and describing how building inspections were falsified to hide dangerous construction practices. Richard Hartwell operated like a mob boss, Marcus testified. He had dirt on everyone, and he used blackmail and intimidation to maintain control. When people threatened to expose him, they had accidents or committed suicide or just disappeared. The federal investigators had found 3 more bodies buried at Richard's construction sites, including the journalist who had been investigating the corruption and a building inspector who had refused to approve a particularly dangerous project. Each victim had threatened to expose the fraud scheme before their death. Patricia had recovered from the mercury poisoning, but the experience had changed her profoundly. She testified about years of psychological abuse and the gradual realization that her husband was slowly killing her. "I knew something was wrong when I started having memory problems and severe headaches," she told the court. But Richard convinced me it was stress from his work demands. He even suggested I see a psychiatrist for anxiety, knowing the mercury poisoning was causing neurological symptoms. The medical expert who testified about mercury poisoning explained that Patricia would have died within 6 months if the poisoning had continued. Richard's plan had been to have her death appear natural, eliminating a potential witness while gaining sympathy as a grieving widower. Emma's testimony was particularly powerful because of the recordings she had made. The jury listened to Richard's voice planning murders and discussing the logistics of covering up his crimes. Her courage in documenting his conversations had provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. "I started recording him because I knew something was terribly wrong," Emma explained. "My father figure was planning to kill people I loved, and I couldn't let that happen." The prosecution also presented evidence of Richard's theft from my biological parents' inheritance. Harold Brennan testified about the elaborate scheme Richard had used to access funds that legally belonged to me, forging documents and creating false guardianship claims. Over 17 years, Richard Hartwell stole approximately $2 million from Cletus Coleman's inheritance, Harold explained. He used these funds to finance his criminal operations and personal lifestyle while the rightful heir lived under his roof, unaware of his true parentage. The civil lawsuits were proceeding simultaneously with the criminal trial. Families affected by Richard's construction fraud were seeking damages not just from his estate, but from the city officials who had enabled the corruption. The potential liability was enormous, with some estimates suggesting total damages could exceed $50 million. But the money wasn't what mattered most to the victims. What they wanted was acknowledgement of what had been done to them and assurance that it would never happen again. During a break in testimony, I spoke with Maria Santos, whose 8-year-old daughter had been permanently disabled in the elementary school ceiling collapse. "Isabella still has nightmares about that day," Maria told me. "She was sitting at her desk when the ceiling came down. If she had been sitting 6 inches to the left, she would have been killed instead of just paralyzed." The weight of my father's crimes felt crushing. These weren't abstract financial crimes or victimless fraud. Real people had been hurt and killed because of his greed. "I'm so sorry," I said, knowing the words were inadequate. "It's not your fault," Maria replied kindly. "You were a victim too. What matters is that you had the courage to expose the truth." On the final day of testimony, the prosecutor called me back to the stand for closing questions. "Mr. Coleman, what do you hope to accomplish by bringing these crimes to light?" I looked out at the courtroom, seeing Patricia and Emma sitting in the front row, the victims' families filling the gallery, and the defendants who had enabled Richard's crimes for years. "I want to make sure this never happens to another family," I said. "No child should be hurt because someone cut corners to increase profits." No family should lose a loved one because a public official took a bribe to ignore safety violations. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Mayor Davidson and 2 city council members received sentences of 15 to 20 years in federal prison. The building inspector got 12 years. The other contractors involved in the scheme received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. But the most satisfying moment came when the judge announced the creation of a victim compensation fund, using assets seized from Richard's estate, and the corrupt officials. Every family harmed by the construction fraud would receive financial compensation and access to medical care for ongoing treatment. As we left the courthouse, Emma took my hand. "Do you think Dad would be proud of what we did?" "Which dad?" I asked gently. "Our real parents," she clarified. "The ones who died trying to expose this corruption." I thought about Michael and Sarah Coleman, structural engineers who had died because they tried to protect public safety. They had sacrificed their lives to stop exactly the kind of fraud we had exposed in court. "I think they would be very proud," I told her. We finished what they started. Patricia joined us on the courthouse steps, looking healthier and stronger than I had seen her in years. The mercury poisoning had been cleared from her system, but more importantly, she was free from the psychological prison Richard had created around our family. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked at the 2 women who had become my real family through shared trauma and mutual protection, rather than blood or legal documents. "Now we build something better," I said. 1 year later, I stood at the podium of the National Construction Safety Conference in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of engineers, building inspectors, and government officials from across the country. The speech I was about to give would have been impossible to imagine when I was that 20-year-old holding a bus ticket at Chicago O'Hare. "My name is Cletus Coleman," I began, "and I'm here to tell you about what happens when construction fraud goes unchecked and the people responsible for public safety forget their duty to protect innocent lives." The audience listened intently as I described the systematic corruption that had plagued Cook County, the injuries and deaths that resulted from substandard construction, and the investigation that brought down an entire network of criminals. But I also talked about the positive changes that had emerged from the tragedy. The Cletus and Emma Coleman Foundation for Construction Safety had been established using my reclaimed inheritance and contributions from across the country. In just 1 year, we had funded safety inspections that prevented 3 potential building collapses, provided medical care for victims of construction fraud, and lobbied for stricter oversight of public building projects. Emma had graduated high school a semester early and chosen to study social work with a focus on helping families affected by white-collar crime. She testified regularly before legislative committees advocating for stronger whistleblower protections and victim compensation programs. Patricia had found her own path to healing by becoming a counselor, specializing in domestic abuse survivors. Her experience with psychological manipulation and gradual poisoning had given her unique insights into how abusers maintain control over their victims. She helped other women recognize the signs of abuse and develop strategies for safe escape. "The most important lesson I learned," I told the conference audience, "is that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they choose to stand up against corruption and injustice. You don't have to be a superhero or a government official to make a difference. Sometimes you just have to be willing to do the right thing even when it's dangerous." After my speech, I was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a structural engineer from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. "Mr. Coleman, we've been following your foundation's work with great interest," she said. "We're launching a new initiative to improve construction oversight nationwide. Would you consider joining our advisory board, here?" The offer represented an opportunity to prevent the kind of tragedy that had defined my early life from happening to other families. It was exactly the kind of work my biological parents would have supported. "I'd be honored," I replied. That evening, Emma, Patricia, and I had dinner at a restaurant near our hotel. It was a tradition we had started after the trial ended, having regular family meals where we could talk about our lives without the shadow of Richard's crimes hanging over us. "I got accepted to Northwestern," Emma announced, grinning broadly. "Full scholarship for their social work program." Patricia beamed with pride. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Your father figures would be so proud. It had taken time, but we had learned to honor both sets of parents in our conversations. Michael and Sarah Coleman for their integrity and courage, and even Richard in a complicated way, because his evil had ultimately brought us together as a real family. "What about you?" Emma asked me. "Any news from the engineering program?" I had been accepted to the University of Illinois Civil Engineering program with a specialty in structural safety. My goal was to complete the work my biological parents had started developing better standards for public construction projects. "Classes start in the fall," I said. "And Dr. Walsh offered me a research position with NIST after graduation. I'll be working on new technologies for detecting construction fraud before buildings are completed." Patricia raised her glass of wine. "To Michael and Sarah Coleman, who showed us that some things are worth dying for, and to their son, who showed us that some things are worth living for." We toasted quietly, remembering the people who had been lost, but celebrating the family we had become. The next morning, I received a call from Harold Brennan with unexpected news. "Cletus, I just got word from the federal prosecutor. They've arrested Vincent Torres's contact in the Chicago Police Department. Apparently, Richard had been bribing cops to cover up his murders for years. Even a year later, we were still discovering the full extent of Richard's criminal network. Each new arrest brought justice for more victims, but also revealed how deep the corruption had spread." "There's something else," Harold continued. "The city of Chicago wants to settle the civil lawsuits. They're offering $60 million in compensation for all the victims. The money would never bring back the people who had died or fully heal those who had been injured, but it would ensure that families like Maria Santos could afford the medical care her disabled daughter needed for the rest of her life. There's one more thing, Cletus. The city wants to name the new elementary school they're building to replace Riverside Elementary after your biological parents, the Michael and Sarah Coleman Elementary School." I felt tears in my eyes. My parents' names would be remembered not for how they died, but for what they had tried to accomplish. Children would attend a school built with proper materials and safety standards, protected by the oversight systems we had fought to establish. That afternoon, I visited Michael and Sarah Coleman's graves for the first time since learning their true identities. Their headstones were simple granite markers in a suburban cemetery, with dates showing they had died far too young. I placed flowers on each grave and spoke to them as if they could hear me. "I finished what you started," I said quietly. "The people who killed you are gone, and the corruption you tried to expose has been destroyed. Your grandson and your adopted daughter are safe, and they're going to spend their lives making sure other families don't have to go through what we did." A gentle breeze rustled the trees around the cemetery, and for a moment I could almost feel their presence. Not the ghostly visitation of movies, but the simple knowledge that their sacrifice had meaning, and their work would continue. When I returned to our hotel, I found Emma and Patricia packing for the flight home to Chicago. But it wasn't really home anymore. We had sold the Winnetka mansion and bought a modest house in Evanston, closer to Northwestern, where Emma would be attending school. The new house had no hidden compartments, no secret documents, and no ghosts of past crimes. It was just a place where three people who loved each other could build a future based on honesty and mutual respect. "Are you ready to go home?" Patricia asked as I walked into the hotel room. I thought about the question seriously. Home wasn't a building or a location. It was the sense of belonging and security I felt with these two women who had stood with me against evil and emerged stronger on the other side. "Yeah," I said, putting my arm around both of them. "I'm ready to go home." As our plane took off from Washington, D.C., I looked down at the city below and thought about all the people working in government buildings and offices making decisions that affected millions of lives. Some of them were corrupt, interested only in personal gain, but many more were honest public servants trying to do the right thing for their communities. The difference between them wasn't intelligence or opportunity. It was the willingness to choose integrity over profit, even when the cost was high. I had learned that lesson in the most difficult way possible by discovering that the man I thought was my father was actually a monster who had destroyed countless lives for money. But I had also learned that good people exist everywhere, and when they work together, they can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. The foundation Emma and I had created would continue fighting construction fraud long after we were gone. The laws we had helped pass would protect future generations of children from building collapses and structural failures. The oversight systems we had advocated for would make it much harder for another Richard Hartwell to operate with impunity. But most importantly, we had learned that families aren't just created by blood or legal documents. They're forged by people who choose to protect and support each other, especially when the stakes are highest. As I looked at Emma reading her social work textbooks and Patricia reviewing files from her counseling practice, I realized that Richard's greatest failure wasn't his criminal empire or his multiple murders. It was his inability to recognize the value of what he already had. He could have been part of a real family built on love and mutual respect. Instead, he chose power and money, and in the end he died alone on the floor of his study, surrounded by evidence of his crimes and rejected by everyone who had ever cared about him. We had chosen differently. When faced with the choice between personal safety and protecting others, we had risked everything to do what was right. When given the opportunity to profit from Richard's crimes by staying silent, we had chosen justice. Instead, that choice had cost us our security and innocence, but it had given us something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that we could face any challenge as long as we faced it together. The plane banked left as we approached Chicago, and I could see the skyline where I had grown up thinking I knew who I was and where I belonged. Now I understood that identity isn't something you're given at birth. It's something you create through your choices and actions. I was no longer the unwanted adopted son who had been handed a bus ticket while his family flew to Dubai. I was Cletus Coleman's son of engineers who had died fighting corruption, brother to a brave young woman who had risked her life to protect others, and friend to a survivor who had found the strength to escape years of abuse. Together we had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to any of us and transformed it into a force for protecting other families from similar tragedies. That transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been months of therapy, legal battles, media attention, and the constant pressure of knowing that people's lives depended on our testimony and advocacy. But we had persevered because we understood something that Richard never could. The greatest power in the world isn't the ability to destroy or control others. It's the capacity to heal, protect, and create something beautiful from the wreckage of tragedy. As we landed in Chicago and prepared to return to our new life, I thought about all the families who were safer because of what we had accomplished. Children attending schools with proper structural engineering, patients in hospitals built with quality materials, families living in apartments that wouldn't collapse or catch fire due to shoddy electrical work. We would never meet most of these people, but they existed because 3 members of a broken family had chosen to fight back against evil instead of accepting victimhood. That night, as I lay in my bed in our new house, I realized that the scared young man who had discovered those documents in Richard's study was gone forever. In his place was someone who understood that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice. The foundation Emma and I had created would continue growing. The laws we had helped pass would save lives. The oversight systems we had advocated for would prevent future tragedies. But the most important legacy of our ordeal wasn't institutional or legal, it was personal. We had learned that love isn't something you receive passively from family members who share your DNA. Love is something you create actively by choosing to protect, support, and sacrifice for people who matter to you. Richard had been surrounded by people who could have loved him if he had made different choices. Instead, he had chosen to see us as tools to be used and obstacles to be eliminated. We had made the opposite choice. When everything fell apart and we could have turned against each other, we had chosen to build something stronger and more beautiful than what had been destroyed. That choice had transformed 3 victims into a family of survivors who would spend their lives making sure other families didn't have to endure what we had experienced. Sometimes the greatest betrayal becomes the foundation for the most profound justice. Sometimes being abandoned and rejected becomes the beginning of finding where you really belong. And sometimes, when your world collapses around you, the debris can be used to build something infinitely better than what existed before. Have you ever experienced a moment where discovering a painful truth ultimately set you free? How did you find the courage to stand up against injustice when it would have been easier to stay silent? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like, subscribe for more true stories of overcoming adversity, and share it with someone who might need to hear that even the darkest situations can lead to hope and healing. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that your courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult can change not just your own life, but the lives of countless others you may never meet.